My paper is about the meaning or the correct reading of the as yourself clause of the second love commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We commonly read the as yourself to mean as you love yourself, namely in the same way or to the same extent that you love yourself. Thus, we take the commandment to command us to imitate or expand our self-love to others. My aim in this paper is to argue that this is not how Kierkegaard reads the as yourself, and to suggest how he does read it. At the bottom line, the crux of my suggestion lies in the fact that the as yourself designates the self. And so the idea is to bring Kierkegaard's understanding of the self and to read the as yourself in light of it and to understand the commandment in light of it. The paper has 3 parts. In the first, I argue against what I shall call the common reading of the as yourself, just presented above, by showing that it is incompatible with Kierkegaard's few claims about the as yourself. In the second, I present my suggested alternative, a reading of the as yourself informed by Kierkegaard's conception of self. And in the third and last part, I defend this reading by showing that it is compatible with Kierkegaard's claims about the as yourself. This last part turns out to be mostly focused on self-love and its relation to a successful love of the neighbor. My problem is that each of these 3 parts is itself a paper. I'm serious. The current version of the full paper is currently 51 pages. So I have too much to say, but the move of the paper is not complete without all 3 parts. So my plan is to take advantage of the fact that the audience is a specialist or loves me a lot. And I will just mark my way through many steps along the way, not giving any detail, and assuming that we can go back and zoom in on any part if we want to talk about it during discussion. Okay, so let us get right to it. As you all know, the second deliberation of works of love opens with a thorough analysis of the love commandment. Each part of the commandment gets a chapter of its own in which it is contemplated in depth. Each part but the as yourself. The as yourself, by contrast, is crammed into 7 pages gross at the beginning of 2a, the chapter dedicated to the shall. The as yourself is discussed as the presupposition of the commandment, and as such, from this point, it is left behind. Nowhere else, as far as I'm aware, does Kierkegaard go back to contemplate the as yourself explicitly. This neglect of the as yourself, the gap relative to the other parts of the commandment, is odd, especially given the importance of the as yourself to a proper understanding and enactment of the commandment. So if by the end of the talk I say nothing about why I think that is the case, or the sense in which the as yourself is the presupposition, or why does it appear together specifically with a shall, and you're curious about any of this, so remind me and we can talk about it. Okay. So focusing on these 7 pages, one can extract 4 claims that Kierkegaard makes about the as yourself directly. And I distinguish claims about the as yourself from claims about self-love, which are also abundant in those 7 pages. It is a common reading that encourages conflating the 2, but for now it is best to keep them apart. In the paper, though I will not get to it here, I go back to the claims about self-love and I explain them with the alternative reading of the as yourself, but we won't get to that today. Okay, so the 4 claims are, first, that the as yourself is the answer to the question how properly to love the neighbor. We are commanded to love the neighbor, and then the as yourself adds a command about how the neighbor is to be loved. In this sense, it is the answer to the question how the neighbor is to be loved, and I shall henceforth just state the question. Okay. The as yourself contains the presupposition of the commandment that every person loves herself. Further, the self-love that the commandment presupposes through the as yourself is improper. These are Kierkegaard's claims I just remind. Third, the as yourself commands or seeks to teach proper self-love. And finally, 4, the as yourself are the only words that can do all of the above at once. No words other than precisely as yourself can constitute such an answer to the question that at once presupposes improper self-love and commands proper self-love. So you can already see that the common reading is a non-starter for Kierkegaard. As you love yourself are words other than as yourself, and therefore the common reading is bound to fail the threefold function of the as yourself as Kierkegaard delineates it. Indeed, and despite the fact that this is how we read it across times and cultures, as you love yourself is simply not what the commandment says. If the commandment wanted to say as you love yourself, as yourself is simply not the correct way to say it. In Hebrew, it is even more grammatically awkward to read it this way. And Hebrew is the original of the commandment. So while Kierkegaard praises the brilliance of the conciseness and precision of the as yourself, the common reading renders it ungainly and defective. But let us witness the failure of the common reading to fulfill the threefold function. So the common reading proposes to answer the question by as you love yourself, namely, how is the neighbor to be loved in the same way that you love yourself? This answer has a descriptive version, according to which the answer is as you in fact love yourself, and it has a normative version, according to which the answer is as you ought to love yourself. Both fail. Starting with the descriptive, the problem is obvious. The self-love that the commandment presupposes is improper. So if you're commanded to love the neighbor as you in fact love yourself, you're commanded to love the neighbor improperly. Also, it in no way commands proper self-love, but this is the least of our problems with it. Moving to the normative, first, it contains no presupposition about whether and how you in fact love yourself. As you ought to love yourself says no such thing, properly or otherwise. But much more importantly, I argue that the normative version of the common reading fails to constitute an answer to the question at all. In the paper, the argumentation is much more elaborate. Here, I'm going to just mark off the general idea. So before turning to sketch the arguments, note the general principle. We ask, how is the neighbor to be loved? And we get the answer in the same way that you ought to love yourself. Well, awesome, but how ought I to love myself? Any answer to this question is already not given by the as yourself. So the final answer to the question at best lies outside of the commandment, which is implausible in its own right, but in any case incompatible with Kierkegaard's claims about that the as yourself constitutes the answer, the most brilliant and accurate answer to this question. So in terms of the arguments, in the paper, I showed that if we incorporate what Kierkegaard says about proper self-love in those same 7 pages, the normative version ensnares the commandment in an infinite regress. Then I discuss the treatment of the normative version in the secondary literature. I show their strategy out of the regress, or just the fact that they ignore the regress and sort of interpret Kierkegaard differently on this point. But I show that in any case, in any case, their strategy is mostly to answer the question about proper self-love with neighborly love, in which case the answer is circular. And then they attempt to sort of account for what neighborly or proper love in general is by appealing to resources outside of the commandment. So we either get an infinite regress or a circle or an answer that lies outside the commandment. In all those cases, the as yourself fails to answer the question. So indeed, the common reading in either version fails Kierkegaard's claims about the as yourself, exactly as the fourth claim predicted. This means that we should seek an alternative, which starts by drawing the lesson. Trying to understand what the as yourself means, we are not looking for other words with which to complete it. As yourself is the answer. It is complete and exceedingly accurate. What we are looking for is to understand this answer. Moving to the second part of the paper, insisting that the answer is as yourself, we can now see very clearly that it designates the self. This fact, particularly in Kierkegaard, is profound. Let me pause here for a brief moment and say that everything that follows from this part is my attempt to make sense of the as yourself, seeing that it designates the self. But whether or not you buy into this attempt, I hope you at least take this, that the as yourself designates the self, that the common reading fails, and that it is the self that should inform our understanding of the commandment and of neighborly love. Okay, so back to my attempt. I first give an account of the self. Now, obviously, it is an initial and tentative account of the self because it is impossible to really account for Kierkegaard's understanding of the self within the scope of a single paper focused on something else. The notion of the self permeates the authorship in its entirety, more or less. Also, it is not an account of the metaphysical nature of the self that I give in this paper, even though I do have such an account, which I believe is compatible with the things that I do in this paper, but I cannot treat it now. So the features of the self by which I wish to inform the As Yourself in this paper are that it is the ultimate religious duty and that it is a singular duty. I explain what I mean by these, but I don't justify these claims here in the talk. I do so in the paper, so we can talk about it later if you disagree that the self is either the ultimate religious duty or a singular duty. Okay, so by ultimate, I just mean the duty which leaves nothing out. If you abide by this duty, then you violate no religious duty, and if you do not abide by this duty, you abide by no religious duty. It includes it all. Assuming that God creates each person for some purpose, I take it that this purpose is one's ultimate duty. You are to strive to fulfill the purpose for which God created you. It doesn't matter for current needs, whether it is really a single thing that God created you for or a sum or whatever, like the purpose for which God created you. Yeah, okay. So you are to strive to fulfill the purpose for which God created you. And so long as you do this, there is nothing else that God wants from you. And so long as you do not strive to fulfill the purpose of your existence, no matter what other religious duties you think you abide by, you're fulfilling no religious duties, you are sinning. The self, I contend, is that which marks the purpose of your existence. Again, I do justify this textually to an extent in the paper. I take the duty to become yourself to just be the duty to fulfill the purpose of your existence. The self you receive from God is this purpose, and becoming it is your ultimate religious duty. By a singular duty, I mean a duty that is equivalent to an identity property, which means that only a single individual has this duty and has it in every moment of her existence. Further, for Kierkegaard, singular duties are such that one person's singular duty is another's sin. So I take it that God creates each individual for a purpose, for a purpose particular or unique to her, such that each self constitutes a singular duty. I and I alone have the duty to become myself, and I have this duty of every moment of my existence, and trying to become the self of another is sin. So becoming yourself is a singular and ultimate religious duty. Against this, I bring the following passages from Kierkegaard. I quote at length, but I'll read it because it's beautiful. The position is just this: to love the neighbor, or to exist essentially equally for every human being. Any other position is divisive, however advantageous and comfortable and seemingly significant that place is. Governance cannot use the person who has placed himself there, because he is indeed in rebellion against governance. But the one who accepted that slighted, that scorned and disdained proper place, that one in the hour of death will dare to say consolingly to his soul, I have done my part. And a page later, truly only by loving the neighbor can a person achieve the highest, because the highest is to be able to be an instrument in the hand of governance. But as previously stated, anyone who has placed himself in any other position, that person steers on his own, and all his achievements, even if it were transforming the world, is an illusion. He was a self-willful, self-wise person. However ludicrous, however frustrating, however inexpedient loving the neighbor may seem in the world, it is still the highest a person is capable of doing. So it seems to me that the purpose of every person's existence is loving the neighbor. The position is just this. This is what we are created for. Hence, becoming yourself amounts to loving the neighbor. At the same time, the self is a singular duty, which means that I and I alone have the duty to love the neighbor, which for you is sin. But you too have a duty to love the neighbor, which for me is sin. In the same way that both of us have the duty to become ourselves, but the duty is different for each of us. So we see now that both of us have the duty to love the neighbor, but the duty is different for each of us. So this is prior to any account of the as yourself. This is simply my account of the self for the purposes of this paper. Seeing that the self is the ultimate religious duty and that it is a singular duty, it turns out against what Kierkegaard says in Works of Love, that the self is a unique neighbor lover. The self of each person is a position of a neighbor lover, and each person has her own position to occupy. Becoming yourself is occupying this position. So the as yourself designates this position. It commands you to love the neighbor as the unique neighbor lover that you are meant to become. This is the answer to the question, how ought you love the neighbor as the unique neighbor lover you are meant to become? For the rest of the second part, I explained this answer, thereby elaborate on it. I hope that the answer sort of reveals itself more and more and gains content through this explanation. So first, I account for the notion of different positions of neighbor lovers. How can the duty to love the neighbor be different for me and you, to the extent that it can be sin on my part to love the neighbor as you are commanded to love him? So the idea is that there are different ways of loving, and each person lives and is created for the purpose of loving in a different way. To illustrate this thought, I appeal to Kierkegaard's discussion of the recognizability of love by its fruits in the chapter A1 of Works of Love. That's titled that way. Yeah. Okay. Different trees grow different fruits. Kierkegaard brings here the passage from Luke that figs are not gathered from thorns. I don't remember exactly. Sorry for not bringing the exact quote. I'm sure you all remember it and know it. And by the fruits, we can recognize the tree. And love, says Kierkegaard, is as well recognizable by its fruits. Of course, in this discussion, Kierkegaard brings this idea of the recognizability of love by its fruits to discuss many wonderful things, in particular, the ineffability of love. I just used the metaphor for the purposes of explaining the notion of different ways of loving, but in a way compatible with things that Kierkegaard says in this discussion. Okay, so what are the fruits of love? They are its outer expressions or manifestations, loving words, loving deeds, everything that is done or takes place out of love. I think we should include here the effects of those words and deeds as well. They are as well outer manifestations of love, things that can testify to love's presence and quality and maybe even kind. So the thought, which I hope you can also trace back to your experience, is that each person has her own way of loving. Each person's love manifests in a different way, experienced in a different way, affects and benefits in a different way. So each person's love grows different fruit. The claim that each person is created for the purpose of loving the neighbor can be understood as a claim that each person is created for the purpose of growing fruits of love and giving them to every person. While the claim that each person is created for a unique such purpose can be understood such that each person is created for the purpose of growing unique fruits and giving them to every person. To quote again from the same chapter, another and much more important thing is the gospel's summon to the single individual, that he bear in mind that the tree is known by its fruits, and that it is he or his love that in the gospel is compared to the tree. What emerges is that there are infinitely many different ways of loving originating in God. And I like to think of it such that God embodies each such way of loving in a person, putting them on this earth for the purpose of loving in this way. Creating persons, and maybe other things as well, is God's way of giving love to creatures, in a sense. Maybe not the only way, but a way of giving love to creatures, of affecting and benefiting them with this kind of love. God's way of having this kind of love manifest in the world. Thus, you are entrusted with a certain unique ability to love that you alone are given. Fail to manifest this love of yours, and it will not be manifest in the world. No creature will enjoy its fruits. Hence, the commandment commands you to manifest this love for the sake of which you, exist. It commands you to manifest this love to its fullest and to give it to everyone. This is your job. If you won't love people with your love, no one will, and they will miss on its marvel and benefit. And no one should be deprived from your unique way of loving. You are not to give it to a selected few, because God gave you this ability to love and put you on this earth to love God's creatures in this way. God loves all and creates you to manifest this love for all. This picture explains the infinite responsibility, the urgency of the duty, and the infinite debt. Okay, next I move to explaining why the as yourself, thus understood, is the final answer to the question. One might think, I'm doing very badly on time, okay. Okay, one might think that once answered as the unique neighbor lover you are meant to become, there is still need or room to ask, but how does this intended neighbor lover loves? Now I know that the as yourself points to the unique way of loving that God created me for, but I don't know what this way is. So how can I abide? I still don't know how I ought to love the neighbor. So here I have a very cool and very important discussion of the notion of a Christian answer, or the essentially Christian mode of answering, which Kierkegaard discusses in Love is the Fulfilling of the Law. But I think I would have to skip it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let me see how much I have left. Not that much. I'm not doing that. Okay. So the basic idea is that Christian answers are not by way of propositional content so much, or at least they do not aim to explain things to you or to give you knowledge. Instead, they simply contain a task, which imprisons you in particular. Christian answers go something like, hey, you, stop asking questions. Here is what you need to do. Trust me, you don't need to know anything further in order to do it. Once a Christian answer is given, any further question is a sign of disobedience and lack of humility and mistrust and sagacity and tempting deception. The as yourself, as I suggest to read it, is a Christian answer. I elaborate more on this in the paper. It contains the task, that of becoming yourself, and of course it imprisons you in particular by designating yourself. It should be obvious that this is the correct result, that the as yourself is a Christian answer, which I support textually in the paper. And I also show in the paper that the as yourself of the common reading fails to be a Christian answer. Okay. And now we are left to see that indeed, once the question is answered, as I suggest, no further knowledge is needed in order to start doing. So the basic idea here is that you are already yourself. Of course, you are not already the self that God created you to be. You do not already, you're not already the self that you have the duty to become, but you are already the person created for the purpose of becoming the self, and so already the person with the nature relevant for becoming that self. If you are created for the purpose of loving in a certain unique way, you are created with the ability to love in this way. This unique ability to love is your ability to love. So every instance of your love is a manifestation of this ability. Hence, you do not need to know what fruits of love you are meant to grow in order to grow them. Whenever you love, these fruits will grow. By default, they will be small and sour and few. But the thought is that the more you love, the better you get at it. The more fruit you're able to grow, the better you know how to grow it. And the more and better fruits you can grow. Thus, there is nothing further you need to know in order to start loving as yourself. The more you love, the more as yourself it will be. So this is the answer to the question. You are to love the neighbor as the unique neighbor lover that you are meant to become, And the way to do this is just to start loving now and striving to love everyone. Under this reading of the As Yourself, the commandment is not to expend your self-love to others, but rather to embrace and perfect the unique love ability given to you by God and to use it with every person. That's it for the suggested reading of the As Yourself. Moving to the third and final part, the defense of this reading. I will present here much less than appears in the paper, but I think it should be sufficient for current needs. So basically what I do here is to show that this reading is compatible with Kierkegaard's claims about the As Yourself from the first part. Namely, I show that As Yourself as the answer to the question, which is what I just delineated, presupposes improper self-love and commands proper self-love. To do this, I first give an account of self-love. As with the self earlier, this too is initial and tentative. But my claim here is that self-love is to be analyzed in terms of willing to be yourself. Improper when willing to be yourself improperly, and proper when willing to be yourself properly. Again, I simply explain what I mean by this, and I leave out the justification for now. We can talk about it. So willing to be yourself is the term or notion which Kierkegaard uses in The Sickness to analyze both despair and faith. Despair is not willing to be your true self, which is reducible to a willing to be yourself in despair, which means a willing to be a self that is not your true self, or what amounts to the same thing, a willing to be yourself away from God, apart from God. While faith, as depicted by the formula which describes the state in which despair is entirely rooted out, is a matter of relating to or identifying with your true self and willing to be that self. Properly to love yourself is to will to be your true self. Well, improperly to love yourself is to will to be something else. Okay. If this analysis is granted, then the presupposition that the As Yourself contains should be that every person is in despair, and what the As Yourself commands should be that you will to be your true self. The presupposition that the As Yourself contains is that you are a self. And the commandment that it contains is that you become yourself. By presupposing that you are a self, the As Yourself indeed presupposes that you are in despair, because every self despairs by default. If you are a self, you are in despair so long as you fail to become yourself. And you become yourself only when you strive to love the neighbor as yourself. So the commandment rightly presupposes that you are in despair when it is given to you. And by commanding you to love as yourself, the commandment commands you to become yourself, and you cannot become yourself without willing to be yourself, without relating to your true self and willing to be it. We can talk about the justification for that claim as well later. So by answering the question, by commanding you to love as you are created to love, as yourself, the commandment presupposes that you love yourself improperly and commands you to love yourself properly. Indeed, this is the presupposition of the commandment and the starting point of the discourse as a whole, that you are a self, namely, that you are created for the purpose of loving in a certain way every person. Since you are a self, this is what you shall do. You shall love the neighbor as yourself. Thank you very much.